Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, November 18th, 2024. I'm Gary Starakoff. Thank you for joining us. Congress returned for their final week of work before their Thanksgiving break. The Senate today continued work on President Biden's judicial nominations, while a handful of bills are on the House agenda, including one that requires tracking barcodes on mail-in ballot envelopes and another that bans the U.S. government from doing business with anyone with ties to the current Venezuelan government. House Democrats will hold their leadership elections for the next Congress. That is scheduled for tomorrow. And while Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and his top two deputies are all slated to run for reelection unopposed, multiple media outlets report that Jasmine Crockett of Texas plans to challenge Debbie Dingell of Michigan as chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. That's the group that puts out the party's political messaging. CBS News Scott McFarlane will tell us more about where we stand with the House and Senate leadership coming up. President Biden is at the G20 Summit in Brazil. In his opening remarks, he talked about global development and support for Ukraine and Israel. Meanwhile, reaction continues on reports that the Biden administration has given Ukraine the green light to use long-range U.S. missiles for strikes inside Russia, with a top Russian official saying the U.S. is adding, quote, fuel to the fire. We'll hear from Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner on the use of those missiles in Ukraine in a few minutes, but we start today here in Washington, where Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer talked about hurricane relief efforts.
Today I want to focus on disaster aid, something both Democrats and Republicans have long supported and which impacts people in every state of the country. Earlier today, the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, released a letter addressed to Congress calling for swift action on disaster aid, along with a detailed breakdown of where that money is needed. Right now, a host of federal programs from various agencies are running critically low on the funding they need to function. In some cases, like the SBA, Small Business Administration, funding's already dried up. Without congressional action, the federal government may not be ready to respond to the next wave of disasters when they strike. Without congressional action, communities that are trying desperately to rebuild will be left in the lurch. Many of the programs in need of replenishing focus on the long-term elements of disaster recovery. When disaster strikes, obviously the first priority is getting people out of danger, providing for their immediate needs. But then, homes need to be rebuilt, schools need to be reopened, farmers need to help recover their losses from ruined crops. Roads and bridges and railways need funding for repairs. Businesses need loans to get back on their feet. All of these priorities are running critically low on federal dollars. A month ago, Speaker Johnson said that getting disaster aid would be a priority upon his Congress's return this month. I hope the Speaker honors that commitment and works with Democrats to get disaster aid done as soon as we can. We should not kick the can down the road nor withhold vital resources the federal government needs to properly help recovering communities. It's a long-standing tradition that when any community is hit by disaster in this great country, we all rally together to help our fellow Americans. With just a few exceptions, this has almost been nonpartisan. That's how it should be on issues like this that impact communities of all kinds and in all places. We must work together to get disaster aid done as soon as possible so that we'll be ready the next time disaster strikes.
We'll have more on that White House request for federal disaster aid coming up. In his remarks, Republican leader Mitch McConnell talked about the Senate's ongoing work on judicial nominations.
I've spoken before about the ongoing campaign to undermine the federal judiciary. Left-wing activists and elected colleagues alike continue to make their disapproval of constitutionalist orthodoxy known at all levels. And federal judges who are worried about where things are headed are in a bind. They can't retaliate using their office because they swore an oath to uphold the law without respect to persons. They can't go on social media to defend themselves or put out press statements. That's because the American people rightly expect their judges to focus on deciding cases interpreting the law, and not engaging in crisis communications. Of course, the founders anticipated some of this dynamic by giving federal judge life tenure. They hold their offices until they give them up, regardless of how loudly law professors may complain. So recent unanswered attacks may not have professional consequences for individual judges, but they do have an alarming effect on the judiciary as a whole. The Article III branch lacks Congress' power of the purse. It can't exercise force like the president. Instead, it relies on the legitimacy of its judgments or its power. And these constant attacks are designed to erode that legitimacy. Leftist law professors and journalists attack the courts, seemingly with impunity. They know they can affect the institution while their targets have to just sit there and take it. And that's why I'm so vocal and consistent in my defense of the federal judiciary.
Now, the Senate is scheduled to vote at 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time to confirm Embry Kidd to be the U.S. Court of Appeals judge for the 11th Circuit. That's the court that hears federal appeals from Alabama, Florida, and Georgia. More now on the House Democrats' leadership election, which is scheduled for tomorrow, and reports that Jasmine Crockett of Texas will challenge Michigan's Debbie Dingell to lead the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee. Axios calls the race, quote, the most contested role in senior leadership. Punchbowl News says it exposes, quote, a generational divide between the party's old guard and new social media savvy members on how to win back voters after this November's disappointment. Now, here's what House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries had to say when he was asked about the race on Friday.
I want to ask you about a Dem leadership race. It's clear that freshman Rep. Jasmine Crockett is planning to challenge Debbie Dingell for the DPCC policy chair. What do you make of a freshman kind of putting their hat in the ring for a senior position like that?
Haven't had an opportunity to speak with Jasmine at this point. I've worked closely with Debbie Dingell in the context of her leadership as the chair of the Democratic Policy and Communications Committee, and I think she's done a great job. As is the tradition, other House Democratic leaders don't get involved in leadership races, and it's not my plan to get involved in that leadership race.
As we said, we expect stability among the Democrats' top three, with leader Hakeem Jeffries, Whip Catherine Clark, and caucus chair Pete Aguilar all running unopposed tomorrow. CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane talked about what Representative Jeffries and his team have brought to the job and where we stand with the new House and Senate leadership.
Something quite traditional, something quite untraditional. First of all, when you are in the minority in the U.S. House, you really do not have any ability to control what's on the House floor. That's completely out of your hands. So you have two skills. You have the ability to message, to communicate, to tell America I think should be different, and you have the ability to get at congressional hearings some arguments before the public when the minority asks their questions of witnesses and gives their statements. It's pretty limited bandwidth of power. But over the last year, Hakeem Jeffries has wielded power I can't remember another minority leader wielding. The Republicans have been so stalemated, so gridlocked by that incredibly narrow majority that they've been unable to pass basic things like keeping the government open, spending bills, raising the debt ceiling to avoid a calamity, doing the basic blocking and tackling of government. Hakeem Jeffries has had to intervene and come in with a whole bunch of his votes to get government to actually function. We'll see if he's willing to do that in an all-Republican-controlled Washington, not a divided-controlled Washington next year.
But also an incredibly small margin separating Republicans and Democrats in the House. Once again, we don't know the final numbers, but we're waiting to see those final couple of seats. Take us over to the Senate side. Senate Democrats, their leadership team What do we know at this point?
Still a bit of stability in the leadership ranks. We're not sure just yet until there are final projections made in Pennsylvania, whether it's a 53-47 Senate, if you include the independents who caucus with the Democrats, or somehow, against expectations, 52-48. Either way, Democrats who've been running the Senate for a while now become the minority party. A little more leverage the minority has in the Senate. You do have the ability to impact what happens on the Senate floor. You have the ability to hold up some of what the president or the Senate leadership wants to do. But every indication is that the leadership stays the same. It's Chuck Schumer of New York, Dick Durbin of Illinois, both of whom are using this final bit of runway they have to try to be impactful. Chuck Schumer has been trying to confirm some more of President Biden's judicial nominations. And there was Dick Durbin last week, John, trying to press, as the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman, to get all those Matt Gaetz ethics files over to the Senate for their confirmation hearings. He has the ability as the Democratic majority whip right now, and ultimately the Democratic chair of this committee till January 3rd, to try to push some levers.
What is John Thune's relationship with Chuck Schumer? We're so used to Mitch McConnell and Chuck Schumer. Yeah. What do we need to know about that?
Oh, we're going to find that out, aren't we? 20 years together. I mean, John Thune started in the U.S. Senate in 2005, so this is his 20th year with Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer issued a statement of support for John Thune, congratulating him on his election as Republican leader. That may just be traditional Senate collegiality. We're about to find that out. John Thune has never come across as somebody who's been particularly antagonistic towards Chuck Schumer, nor vice versa, but the roles sure are changing. I think that's one of the big questions to answer over the next 6 months.
On roles changing, we talked about Nancy Pelosi stepping away from leadership, Democrats, Hakeem Jeffries coming in. Now we have Mitch McConnell stepping away after a very long time as the leader of Senate Republicans, John Thune stepping in. But Mitch McConnell's term runs through 2026. What is his role going to be now that he's not one of the first people to speak at the beginning of the day in the Senate? Where does he fit in now as just another senator?
This is so untraditional, isn't it? I mean, think of the last sets of speakers of the House who, when they left that position, left the House altogether.
That was it.
Dennis Hastert, John Boehner, Paul Ryan gone. These are the types of things that have been tradition. Now, Nancy Pelosi has been this Democratic backbencher, but hasn't really carried it that way. She's been a force on cable and network television, giving her opinions. She was potentially pivotal in President Biden's decision to stand down as the Democratic nominee for the White House, and remains this impactful operator working alongside the rest of her caucus and the leadership. That's untraditional. They may still be trying to navigate that. Now you have Mitch McConnell, who will be a rank-and-file senator with a vote. How does that work in concert with John Thune? It's going to be fascinating to find out, but I'll also note, who are the dissenting voices in the Republican conference for some of the more controversial things Donald Trump wants to do? We've seen in President-elect Trump's first term, Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski were dissenting voices. Does Mitch McConnell join that group on some things? Because he's had criticisms of Donald Trump in the past, and the Senate Republicans can lose only 3 Republican votes and get that majority for things Donald Trump wants to do. If Mitch McConnell sometimes joins the caucus of dissenters, there's very little margin for error.
CBS News congressional correspondent Scott McFarlane on this morning's Washington Journal. You can see the whole segment on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org. The House is working on a handful of bills today, including one that requires mail-in ballot envelopes to have tracking barcodes, and another that bans the U.S. government from doing business with anyone who has ties with the current Venezuelan government. And that new federal disaster aid request, The Hill reporting today, it includes roughly $100 billion to help with Hurricane Helene and Milton recovery efforts. In a letter to House Speaker Mike Johnson, President Biden writes, quote, "From rebuilding homes and reopening critical infrastructure such as schools and roads to supporting the nation's farmers and ranchers and ensuring access to healthcare services, impacted communities await your response. There can be no delay." Well, Speaker Johnson talked about the request earlier this afternoon at the Capitol.
I'm just getting back in town. We received the White House's request. I think it's $98 billion. So we'll go to work, of course, evaluating that, and we're going to make sure we deliver for the hurricane victims and the people that have suffered from that. I come from a hurricane state. I know how important that is. But there's a deliberate process that, we go through, and we'll start that in earnest right now.
Meanwhile, the president today at the G Summit at the G20 Summit in Brazil, where he reiterated support for Ukraine and Israel.
The United States strongly supports Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Everyone around this table, in my view, should as well. And by the way, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine led to the highest record food prices in all of history. In Gaza, as I've said before, Israel has a right to defend itself after the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But how it defends itself, even as Hamas cruelty hides among civilians, matters a great deal. The United States has led the world in humanitarian aid to Gaza. And we're going to keep pushing to accelerate a ceasefire deal that ensures Israel's security, but brings hostages home and ends the suffering of the Palestinian people and children. I ask everyone here to increase their pressure on Hamas, which is currently refusing this deal. And on Sudan, we're seeing one of the world's most serious humanitarian crises. 8 million people on the brink of famine. This deserves our collective outrage and our collective attention. External actors must stop arming generals and speak with one voice to tell them, stop tearing your country apart, stop blocking aid to the Sudanese people, stop the violence. Let me close with this. As you know, this is my last G20 Summit. We've made progress together, but I urge you to keep going. I'm sure you will, regardless of my urging or not. This group has within its power to usher in a new era of sustainable development, to go from billions to trillions in assistance of those who most in need. This all may sound lofty, but this group can lay the foundation to make that achievable.
And reaction continues from reports in both the New York Times and Reuters that the White House has made the decision to allow Ukraine to use U.S.-made and supplied long-range missiles in its fight against Russia. The Washington Post reporting today, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov saying, quote, "This is a qualitatively new round of tension and a qualitatively new situation in terms of U.S. involvement in this conflict. It is clear that the outgoing administration in Washington intends to take steps they've said so, to continue to add fuel to the fire and to further provoke the level of tension." That got this reaction from Deputy National Security Advisor John Feiner.
Again, just to be super clear, I'm not confirming any decisions that have or have not been made about U.S. assistance when it comes to these operational questions. I will say, with regard to the comments that came out of Russia, the fire was lit by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So I think this notion of fuel on the fire is frankly a side issue to the main issue, which is Russia waging a war of aggression across a sovereign border into Ukraine and continuing to do so. And we've seen, in addition to the North Korean forces deployment that I mentioned, a major escalation in terms of an aerial attack on infrastructure across Ukraine over the last 24 hours. So I would put the question back to Russia about who's actually putting fuel on the fire here, and I don't think it's the Ukrainians.
He was also asked if the president was planning any more moves to support Ukraine in his final months in office.
So for obvious reasons, we don't tend to muse publicly about things that we are considering doing. When we have a step that we're ready to announce because we've decided on it, we come out and say so. So I won't go into options on the table or that sort of thing, other than to say that we've been very clear that the overriding strategic goal for the rest of this term on Ukraine is to make Ukraine as strong as possible. And that means surging as much material and equipment as we can get into Ukraine over the course of the near term. The President said that quite clearly in September, and we've reiterated it since. It means using all of the funds that have been appropriated for the United States to provide to Ukraine during the rest of this term and this administration. We are on track to execute that. And if we have additional policy changes or policy steps to announce, we will come out and say so. But what we're not going to do is talk about what's on the whiteboard.
And Politico reporting yesterday that Senate Armed Services Ranking Member Roger Wicker and House Intelligence Chair Mike Turner are criticizing the president's timing on letting Ukraine use the long-range missiles. Senator Wicker saying the decision, quote, does not excuse the administration's deliberate slow walking of items and assistance long authorized by Congress for use against Putin's illegal aggression. This devastating conflict could have been ended on terms benefiting the U.S. and NATO if Mr. Biden had listened to the counsel of bipartisan majorities in the House and Senate. And Chair Turner saying, quote, President Biden should have listened to President Zelensky's pleas much earlier, and that he, quote, continues to impose restrictions on Ukraine that prevent Ukrainians from defending themselves and prevent this conflict from ending. You're listening to Washington Today.
The weekly podcast is a unique offering from C-SPAN. We tape it right here in the C-SPAN studios in beautiful downtown Capitol Hill. In a town where extremes get all the attention, this isn't more extreme opinion, it's extreme history. From what's new and happening right now, relive the history you know. So listen, follow, and enjoy the C-SPAN podcast, The Weekly. Find it wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today. It's been almost 2 weeks since Election Day, and we're still waiting for results in a handful of races for the House of Representatives. Those races include Alaska's at-large district where Republican Nick Begich leads incumbent Democrat Mary Peltola by more than 9,000 votes. 98% of the vote total is being reported there. California's 13th district, which runs from Stockton to Fresno, and where incumbent Republican John Duarte leads Democratic challenger Adam Gray by some 2,000 votes, with 87% of the votes in there. Also, California's 45th district, which covers portions of Orange County, with Republican incumbent Michelle Steele leading Democrat Derek Tran by only 36 votes and 91% of the vote in there. And another very close one in Iowa, the 1st congressional district, which covers the southeast portion of the state, and Republican incumbent Mariannette Miller Meeks leading Democrat Christina Bohannon by just 801 votes there. 99% of the vote has been counted. Finally, Ohio 9, which covers the Toledo area, where Democratic incumbent Marcy Kaptur is leading Republican Derek Marin by 1,200 votes, and 94% of the estimated vote total reported there. Meanwhile, in many other states, preparations for the 2026 election are already underway. And today, the top election official in Georgia, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, shared his insights on the 2024 election process. He also talked about issues such as photo ID.
I believe that we should have photo ID for all voting, and I think our model is good. We're not the only state that has photo ID. We use driver's license number, but it takes you back to your Real ID compliant driver's license. You need, in Georgia, to get on an airplane, you need a Real ID, your Georgia driver's license, or another state that's Real ID compliant. I know some states have somehow got around that, but I think in these days and times of national security, it should be Real ID compliant. It just really sets what is your status here. Are you born in America, or are you a naturalized American? Do you have permanent resident status, student visa, whatever that is, work visa? But you just know what your status is. But we know then only American citizens should be voting in elections. It's very easy because you've, at the front of the line, when they're coming into the system, you've actually verified that. And I think that should be part of state law. And now's the perfect time, I think, for the Congress to take that up.
So just, just following up on that, you've worked on both sides of the aisle, you've been in the legislature. How would you approach trying to find consensus on some sort of photo ID? How would you approach that to Congress?
Well, I think you just really need to make the point again and again. The majority of Democrats and Republicans, the grassroots of both political parties, Main Street America, they support photo ID. And I think the politicians need to be reminded of that. If you don't support photo ID, you're not representing your party. You may be representing some fringe element, but you're not representing your party. And if you want to get back in power, you might want to start representing your people.
Republican Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger talking to Donald Palmer, who sits on the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. This event took place at the American Enterprise Institute. You can see all of it on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org. Presidential transition news now, and President-elect Trump has named Brendan Carr as the new chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Brendan Carr is currently the senior Republican on the commission. He was nominated by the president-elect back in 2017, and he is also the author of the chapter on the FCC in the Conservative Blueprint Project 2025. Just 1 hour after thanking the president, Brendan Carr wrote on X, quote, "We must dismantle the censorship cartel and restore free speech rights for everyday Americans." Also today, State Department spokesman Matthew Miller talked about the ongoing transition there. He was asked about the memorandum of understanding that has to be signed before the Trump transition team can begin work.
So a couple things. With respect to the official transition process, no, there's nothing that has changed. I'll let other agencies speak to the memorandum of understanding process. My understanding is that there has not been a signed memorandum of understanding, which is what has to take place before the incoming administration's transition team can come start work here, getting briefed and getting access to information to proceed in the transition process. That process has not changed. There has been an initial contact. I can read out. The Secretary phoned Secretary-designate Marco Rubio yesterday to offer his congratulations on his appointment and to pledge to him, as we have said publicly, that we will do everything within our power to make it a successful transition.
And Politico is reporting that the House Ethics Panel will meet on Wednesday and potentially vote on whether to release a report probing sexual misconduct allegations against Attorney General nominee Matt Gaetz. The meeting comes as Mr. Gaetz' confirmation is in question, with some Republican senators wary of the former Florida Republican serving as the nation's top law enforcement officer. The Politico story says Speaker Mike Johnson is putting pressure on the Ethics Committee members to keep the report under wraps, saying on Friday that he is, quote, going to strongly request the report isn't released because, quote, that is not the way we do things in the House, and I think that would be a terrible precedent to set. Washington Times White House reporter Jeff Murdoch talked about the path to confirmation that Matt Gaetz and other nominees have.
I think the toughest pass is obviously Matt Gaetz. One thing I want to point out before we get into the individuals is there's three threads that run through all of these candidates that he has nominated. One is loyalty to the president-elect. Every one of them has expressed their loyalty. Two is a lack of management experience. You know, Kristi Noem is a great example. The South Dakota government employs 12,000 people. She's now going to be in charge of a department with 260,000 people.
Homeland Security.
Homeland Security, yes. And that is the most, and the 12,000 is the most management experience we've seen from any of these nominees. The third is they've all been heavy critics of this administration. Of the departments they're going to run. The current administration, I meant to say. They've been heavy critics of how these departments have run. A great example is Pete Hegseth, who was nominated to be Defense Secretary and run the Department of Defense, has been extremely critical of saying that under Biden, the Department of Defense has been too focused on, his words, woke initiatives, trying to bring in diversity, well eroding the military's values, again, his words. You've got Matt Gaetz, who has called for abolishing the DOJ and the FBI. So I think that's really interesting to point out that all three threads run through everybody the president has nominated so far. Now back to answering your question. I think the toughest goes to Matt Gaetz. He's embroiled in some a sexual misconduct allegation. There's a House ethics report coming out. Could be very damning.
Do you think that report's going to come out?
I think at some point it will. It's everything on the Hill gets leaked at some point. Everybody's like, when it'll come out. It comes out eventually. So we've got that. It's interesting because Mike Johnson is refusing. So how it's going to come out is what I said. It's going to end up in the desk of some staffer who's going to call a news network and leak it to them. It'll come out. But yes, Mike Johnson's argument for not releasing it is Matt Gaetz resigned the day after he was nominated, which headed off the release of that ethics report. And Mike Johnson's argument is we only have jurisdiction if they're an active member of Congress. If he's no longer a member of Congress, that sets a dangerous precedent that we're now releasing ethics reports of what essentially amounts to a private citizen. So I think that's going to be difficult. Also, he doesn't have any prosecutorial experience. It's a position, and that goes back to what I was saying about in the earlier, one of the threads is the lack of management experience. He practiced law for 2 years, right out of law school at a law firm in Florida, and then he went into politics. I'm not even sure how much he's really practiced as a lawyer. That's a question a lot of people have asked, but he definitely does not have, for a position where you're in charge of prosecuting people on behalf of the federal government, he does not have that prosecutorial experience.
And then who's got the easiest path?
I would say Doug Collins at the Veterans Administration. He's got friends up on the Hill. It's a position where he's talked about reform. There's bipartisan support for reforming the VA. There always has been. And there's really nothing controversial about him.
And that's the largest of the government agencies by civilian employees, some 450,000 civilian employees, because it runs all of these veterans hospitals. Doug Collins, the former Republican congressman from
Georgia,
not South Carolina.
Yeah, Georgia. Yes. So I expect he'll have the easiest pass because it's one of the few things everybody can still agree on at this point in Washington is that the VA is in need of reform. And like I said, he's made a lot of connections during his time on the Hill.
Washington Times White House reporter Jeff Murdoch on this morning's Washington Journal. You can see the entire segment on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org. That's also where you can get this program as a podcast and listen on demand. It's also on YouTube. Just search Washington Today. And for more on the stories that are shaping Washington every day, get our daily email word for word. You can go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for listening today to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy from Washington, D.C. and across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, we'll talk about future U.S. foreign policy under President-elect Trump's administration with University of Virginia's Mara Rudman and Bradley Bowman with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. And then Eric Katz, senior correspondent with Government Executive, looks at how the incoming administration could affect the size and scope of the federal workforce. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Join the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, our free mobile app, or online at cspan.org.